Hello and welcome to our Spotlight webinar with Syxsense. Today, we have our industry expert, Jon Cassell, here to give us an inside look into streamlining patch and vulnerability management through automation. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Jon will reach out after to answer those. And with that, Jon Cassell.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I'm again Jon Cassell, Senior Solutions Architect with Syxsense. We'll be going through specifically patch and vulnerability management, but in an automated fashion with our console today. We're also going to, before we jump into the product and actually start building out a few workflows, I did want to as well take a look at our GigaOm Radar Report. This is brand new for this year. This, of course, is going to be a comparison between a lot of the other competition out there, where they shine, where we shine, pros and cons, of course, of everybody across the board, and standardizing everybody's strong suits. As you see on the screen, I'm looking at the report. We're going to go through a few different sections, specifically around, I think this is specifically patch management, but it also is going to, of course, cover the other topics. So I'm actually going to jump, rather than go through each one of these little sections, directly to the radar. In looking here, we have a feature play on the left, platform play on the right, innovation on the bottom, and then maturity at the top. Maturity is actually a very important piece as well, because it can tell, of course, how long the product has been around. But then as well on the bottom right, we'll also see that legend discussing who's a forward mover, who's a fast mover, and who is an outperformer. You'll see in the listing right here, rather on the graph, Syxsense is recognized as an outperformer. And on the top right, based on the kind of diameter of each one of these, or radius rather, of each one of these circles within the actual radar, we are also recognized as a leader. Fortunately, we don't see any entrants that we're being compared it to. Nobody really has joined the industry for quite some time, as it is actually well matured already, fairly for the endpoint management space and as well for patch management. This is actually looking at Unified Endpoint Management, so it is taking all factors into account, especially remote management, patching, automation, software deployment, and anything else that we, of course, need to, I like to use the term set and forget across our fleet to ensure that devices are proactively being configured. There are many others on the listing, of course, that we see, other familiar names: Manage Engine, Avanti, Tanium, Matrix 42, Microsoft even, with products like Intune. Although it might seem that it is extremely mature, of course, they're not going to get too granular. So that's why we're actually seeing that Syxsense is more on the left-hand side, and that each one of our features are providing direct access to what it is that, of course, we're touting. Patch management, full granularity. Software deployment, full granularity. Real-time visibility is also a big one, in which allows Syxsense to shine. We won't be talking about, of course, the rest of the competition today, but we are going to jump directly down to Syxsense and look a little bit at the strengths and, of course, the overview. Strengths: user-centric management. In the past, it's always been device-centric with us, I would say, for many years. Endpoint specifically, not too much focus on the identity itself, but it is something that we are now adding into our solution. We'll be looking at a little of that today, but this, of course, is going to be more of the push in the recent years of the industry towards an MDM model. Patching has always been our strong suit. If anyone on the call recalls or has ever heard about our pre-vetted content and us being protection partners with various manufacturers, it's because we actually do receive a lot of content in advance. We test them in-house, so that as well allows us to test for our customers, so that the content that actually gets available to our customer base within our console has already gone through proper pre-testing. Doesn't mean that anybody can just go into the console and deploy a patch, say, and it won't cause any issues at all, but it is providing a much larger safeguard, at least initially, for the obvious issues and discrepancies. And then as well, we do include managed services, which also allows us to use real customer environments. And again, going back to our testing, providing real QA, but against live environments. So again, in turn, increasing success for our customer base. Also, wide breadth of support across other operating systems, even in the MDM space. And there are some legacy operating systems today that we do still support technically. Although Microsoft has marked them as end of life, we still retain old content for Windows XP, Windows 7, and corresponding server versions. Reporting is also a big one for us, whether it's in our console, which we'll see today when we get into the demonstration, and then as well the report listing that we already provide. Now, we've actually increased reporting quite heavily in recent years by adding in an API. So all the data points that we're collecting can also be pulled out of the console directly. That's enhancing integration capabilities. If we want to pipe data into Splunk or Datadog or anybody else, Power BI especially, to visualize that data. Lastly, managed services kind of goes hand in hand with patching, although from this perspective, it's our jump into supporting our service providers in a better fashion. So instead, going towards a more multi-tenant model so that service providers can use a single portal of ours that we would spin up, but for many different customer environments. What we'll be looking at today, though, is going to be the focus across patch and vulnerability automation. And if anybody on our in our audience today already has access to a console, has already seen the product, there are going to be a few new features that you'll be seeing today, which will be rolled out in the coming weeks to maybe the next month. So we're going to roll over to the console. And again, the specific focus is streamlining automation for patch and vulnerability remediation. So to do that first, we're not really going to talk about the endpoints today and how we're going to target, rather, which of course Syxsense does have the innate ability to do, basically taking a look at every single individual device within the listing, and we can of course go that route. We don't want to, that's not automation at all, that's manual. So instead, we're not going to consider how we're going to target the endpoints today, but what we actually want to take a look at regarding approval of content and the repairable items that Syxsense provides. With that being said, custom scenarios can always be added into the mix. We won't be talking about a custom piece of content. What we will be looking at is, of course, what Syxsense provides today, and then automating that approval. Now, the actual workflows we'll be designing too do not have to be re-edited or reclassified at a later time. If our specifications change for a remediation scenario, that, of course, is going to change what it is that we're performing. But in this case, the only thing that will be manual for us is when new content gets released, we still want, at least the way I'm going to set this up, is that I still want to approve the remediations. So to do this best, we're going to look at a certain starting point. What I'm going to do is create a query to look at items from our listing, patches or security items, which are generally vulnerabilities, that have a CVSS score of 7 and above. We'll use a new one. I think I have one that's very similar already there, but we're going to go ahead and create a new query. And this is going to be our starting point. We're actually going to create a few. So the main intention here is to allow the remediation to not have to be edited every time we have a change, such as just simply approving new content, like a 0-day advisory. We'll just call this CVSS 7 and above. We are, however, going to pull from both libraries. We do split our content between what's considered a patch and what's considered a general security scan. The only thing that we actually want to start with here is just simply saying that the CVSS score is at least 7 and above. And just to test that, everything in the list below has a CVSS of 7 or higher. And that's all we're going to start with. We are going to do more based on this being our initial kind of use case, such as going through approvals, what it is that we actually want to consider as being approved in terms of a patch, or as well as potentially a vulnerability and the remediations that we include along with it. So when we look at this content, it's going to be a large list. It's what's expected. If you've seen our console in the past, you may have not seen a few of the check boxes that are here. They are brand new, allowing for bulk approval of various security remediations, which we of course want that to be the angles that we're detecting, but also we're solving a lot of these. In my case, most of them have actually already been approved in my demonstration site, but going forward, the intention is that we'll have a container that we can go to in our content listing, specifically more for, say, InfoSec, the security team, to look at and assess the latest repairable items and then approve those when we actually want them to hit production or in the environment. One thing about as well what we're going to be building today, it's not going to consider multi-phases. So we're just going to look at this in terms of one simple scenario for the whole fleet when we actually want to approve these remediations. Now, this isn't going to do much for me alone. This is just looking at all items in the console, 2,200 approximately that are current definitions that have a CVSS of 7 and above that could be affecting my environment. What I want to then as well build out is something a little bit further so we can actually see those changes. So what I'm going to do right now actually is approve everything in this list. Now, we're not going to use necessarily approval of the remediations. By me using the term approval, I'm actually just going to create a group out of them, meaning this is everything that I'm approving right now. Creating a group. And that group, again, today is going to be static. But the intention is that we're actually going to be able to go to our content list, look at a dynamic listing, a question being asked across the content, and then go forward and actually approve what it is that's being shown as outstanding, meaning items that don't exist in our deployment ring that we would then need to add into it. The workflow itself, which we'll be designing, is actually going to handle the rest of it, but we don't want to have to redesign our workflow every time something new has been added. We'll let this load a little bit. I did actually just approve a lot of items to go into the grouping. While that's loading, actually, let's go back to our GigaOm report real quick. There was another item I also wanted to cover, integration. We were recognized as having no support for smart devices or IoT, and of course, this can be an issue in some sectors. It hasn't really been our priority to support proprietary endpoints, but detection of just simply seeing the visibility, I don't believe was taken into account when we were rated here. That is something that is supplied in our product today. So at least visibility of what's in the managed network is something that we can provide. I also thought it was a little silly being recognized as a SaaS only model. There are some products in this list that actually are also only SaaS, or let me phrase this. All products are SaaS based. Only a couple of them actually supply some other type of deployment. So I know that we weren't the only one recognized there with the same statement. Most of them actually have the same exact statement as being a challenge. And it looks like my group is not actually creating. That's okay. Let's try it one last time. That's all right. I think I can get around this actually. Probably just for me being on an alpha release. That's all right though. What we'll actually do instead is focus on the workflow design itself. I wanted to take a little bit of a deeper look at what we can do to perpetually approve or unapprove certain content into that listing. The group was just more of my personal choice. The approval itself is actually baked into every definition. So we can still go to every definition in the console and just auto approve if we want to. I'm not going to be going through that today. Auto approval wouldn't really be my first choice of where I'd want to go with every new 0 day that gets rolled out to automatically include it in a same day scenario. It would be my choice, at least as my recommendation to, of course, pre-vet, take a look at what the remediations include, and then decide, is this something that I actually want my environment to hit my environment today, maybe next week, maybe next month. Before we go into the actual workflow design, though, one other item for anyone in my audience that has not seen this. The really cool piece, which includes the remediation of the vulnerabilities themselves. About half the library today is going to include that pre-built fix. Many items can't really be instantly fixed with some registry change or configuration option. It's probably more systemic, or in some cases, which we're not taking the extra step to do innately, we can opt into it if we want. That would be instead to delete binaries, to immediately uninstall software. That would be our choice as an administrator if we want to get that far into it. With these definitions, though, that have a repairable item, we'll see the full framework in a few moments when we actually build out the full workflow. But for a lot of these definitions, a fix has already been created by our team. And this is essentially what we're leveraging side by side when we patch systems, as well as when we reconfigure to remove the vulnerability, or rather to prevent it from being exploited. As this is technically called, of course, a mitigation, a countermeasure, or workaround to resolve it, but it's not necessarily a patchable scenario that a manufacturer is supplied. With that being said, the manufacturer may have set the initial advisory. This is what you can do to reconfigure your domain controller for a post-patching mitigation, but maybe there was still a patch initially required. After you deploy the patch, you got to do something different. So that could always still be the case. So this will be one of many that we'll actually be including when we get into our remediation. For that remediation template, we're going to use Syxsense Cortex, and Cortex itself can actually include a number of other actions. We're not going to get really crazy with this. I, of course, want to show how easy this can be instead. With developing a new workflow, I'm not going to use the prepackaged templates, but there are about 300 of them today, which we can start with. I'm just going to choose blank at the very top. I'm not going to get too granular. There are a lot of operating system actions that I could include When it comes to some type of process pushing out to our endpoints, we're not going to get really advanced here. We can get into scripting, running snapshots, anything like that, checking the registry, checking the service, re-architecting something, maybe reinforcing the service if it's down. But this is just a simple remediation scenario. The first step I'm actually going to take is going to be a patch deployment. Now, the patch deployment action is not going to be for everything under the sun. It's going to be specifically what we created earlier, CVSS of 7 and above. So if it happens to be a patch and it has a CVSS score of 7 or higher, it will be included in the first phase here to run a patch deploy. Now, this could be different. When we look at the design of the workflow, it is not going to tell us what's necessary right now or what would actually be included right now. The design of the workflow is to accept data from another source of our console and just to pipe it in automatically. That content list we saw earlier is where we get to make those choices. Whatever the query picks up, if our specifications change, or if we actually want to target something different, we can make that choice too. The cool thing about queries in content or in the devices section, they can be pretty much tweaked to target whatever we want. This, however, is specifically a scan and deploy, so it will scan first for those items and deploy whatever's necessary. Doesn't mean that every patch that has a CVSS of 7 is going to be installed or attempted. Just means we're going to check for them first and enforce from that full listing. Before we get to the security resolution, this next step I'm just going to visualize is optional. I would probably detach them in a production scenario. It's this big term we all know, downtime pending reboots. I'm not going to include a reboot here, but I just want to show the interface really quick so everybody can see what it looks like. Although this would be a more benign kind of silent self-enforcement policy that we design, it is possible, however, to include that reboot. So just to show what it looks like, anybody in the audience hasn't seen it, looking at a custom UI reboot, or prompt rather, we could supply a message to an end user post-patching. Actually, I apologize. Let me take a quick step back. Let's first assess if the reboot's necessary. We'll probably start from there, rather than just go directly into a reboot. Upon success of the patch deploy, upon failure, upon nothing being required, we'll accept all scenarios, check for a reboot. If the answer happens to be yes, that's where we would include a post-deployment reboot, where again, we get to choose that template. Inactivity timers, cancel options, deferral options, all up to us. The interface like what you see on the screen would be supplied to the device directly, whichever devices we're pushing this out to, again, giving them that choice. A 1-minute timer in this case is probably not a very good idea, but we could, of course, increase that according to our workstation policy or server policy or roaming laptop policy. So we're not going to include that actually in this example. This, again, is meant to be silent enforcement. Any reboots necessary, we'd probably want to schedule outside of this to not be a, say, hourly fashion or to run these remediations every 4 hours. Reboots are probably like more of a once a month scenario. So the next step here is upon the pre-deployment of patching being required, we're going to run then a security resolution. The reason they're detached, again, is that security resolutions are not patches. They are pre-built scripts, changing the registry, running WMI queries. In some cases, they will uninstall software, hence the red banner here saying that there are going to be a number of items that could potentially be affected by it. So be very well aware of what is being approved. I'm not, however, going to choose everything under the sun. I'm going to use the same exact query from earlier that will look at CVSS of 7 and above for repairable vulnerabilities. Upon a pre-deployment for the patches, whether nothing's necessary, whether it failed, let's still move forward into the actual security resolution. This is actually all that's necessary in just an enforcement scenario. Again, we can get into it much more in depth in terms of notifications, sending emails. The failure is not actually taken into much account here. It's just saying move forward anyways. But we'd also probably want to include something like a trigger to the help desk. Those are all options, of course, through the Cortex framework. I'm not going to make that choice and get granular. I'm just simply going to say that this is CVSS 7 and above, all repairable, all repairable items. Now, the workflow design itself doesn't do anything. We haven't gotten really anywhere with it. We've just said now we have a workflow. The workflow is based upon content that we are pre-filtering. As mentioned, we're not going to get much into device targeting. but we do have to assess how often is this workflow going to run, because maybe we still do want to publish that policy. So going into my workflow list, one of the items we're going to look for again is that workflow, but we're also going to bake it into a policy. Here's the workflow design. It's never ran. So if I click on these items, we don't have anything tracked yet because I've never published it, but that would be our next step. Publishing a policy for this particular workflow around an interval, around a network change, around user login. These are different options we can use to trigger said event. We don't want these to be reactive in any way, whether the device is currently connected or it's switched off. Any level of downtime outside the interval that we're about to set would allow machines to then run it over again. And that's the intention. If a device, say, maybe 30 minutes is probably a little bit too fast for, say, a patch scenario, let's go with maybe every 1 day to start with. Every 1 day, the following policy will run to deploy all patches that have a CVSS score of our threshold, and as well any of the remediations. And again, the key thing here is that it's going to push them in bulk. Every 1 day, it'll assess for devices checking in. Have you ran it? The device is actually not checking in to ask that question. The device has the template locally. So although a device on an airplane may not be able to pull the latest patches, it'll still run its workflow. It'll say, no, a connection to the internet. It'll then check in later and then run that connection. But the point is that it's not relying on the server to tell it everything. It still has that schedule built into the actual client. So every 1 day, if a device switches off for 36 hours, clearly it's 12 hours past that start time, it would instantly kick off its policy to say, I have missed something, I now need to run it. The last question would, of course, then be the targeting. So we're not going to focus so much on this today. Streamlining, though, is that main topic for today's session, though. And so to streamline this best, since we're already using a dynamic query to pick up the required content, we can as well target queries within the devices section. Maybe this is a policy that we want to apply towards all workstations in our console without getting granular down to certain departments. We can make that choice across specific departments for our line of business, knowing that our company might be a little bit different than the next, using custom queries. So it is possible. And as well, we can also bake it off, of course, the AD structure. Although we are not dependent upon Active Directory, we are domain agnostic. It could be a choice that we would make as well. We want to sync with Active Directory, pull in the OU structure, and then target certain OUs for this type of policy. That is a possibility. We would keep this easy, though. Like mentioned, we'll just target all workstations. All workstations are going to run a remediation policy every 24 hours to make sure that they are deploying the required patches and pushing out those repairable items. Once we make that choice, our last step really is just to click save. The policy will kick off in the background, deploying all required items. I am actually going to click save here. It will probably kick off in my demonstration environment, although that's probably fine because my environment's pretty unhealthy, but it would allow me to go ahead and push that out. And the one piece I didn't show today, because I think my group's a little funky there in terms of what I had selected, is going to be the overall approval. However, the actual vulnerability remediations can be approved on a large scale. Every item here that has a little item saying, every line item saying it's got an approved checkbox, it's our choice whether we want to approve individually, or we can use the checkboxes at the very top and just say approve all. That's what I've done clearly here in this case. All my vulnerabilities are approved and they're all set to auto approval. So if I want this to be as easy as possible, I've set my specific threshold. If CVSS is 7 and above is the only thing that I really care about, I would probably disagree for many industries. You should probably focus on a lower score. But for this example, we started at 7. Every item that has a CVSS of 7 and above is automatically approved. The workflow has been set to a 24-hour policy for all workstations. So the only thing that would maybe have to include a change is if my specifications of the CVSS threshold change. I can go in and just change the number in the query. Instantly, the workflow will pick up that change. And as well, if my device targeting has for whatever changed. Or as well, maybe we don't want to do it every 1 day. We want to bump it up to every 12 hours, or maybe every 1 day is a little bit too frequently. I have a lot of customers that do it every 5 to 7 days. That would work fine too. So when I thought about the term streamlining for this particular presentation, I wanted to make it as easy as possible so that our data points can flow into the workflow and not involve us having to constantly track that workflow. We can. That is, of course, something that we have the ability to do from a real-time scenario and from a tracking interface that is built in, but this keeps it as easy as possible so we can move on to the next base. Based on what we covered today, again, I just wanted to make it a little bit more hands-on. Happy to answer any other questions from anybody outside today's call. Please feel free to reach out as well. I did want to cover a few reports today, but I'm always happy to send these across to for anyone directly. I have plenty of reports from real customer environments, taking a look at how we assess, how we perform baselines, and of course, the changes that we make to actually, of course, remediate environments. An unhealthy environment like this one, or a healthy environment like the following. So anybody in the audience wants to see more, please let us know. Nothing further, I'll let everybody go and thank you for attending.